The idea of a medieval prison is simple. It is a dark, damp dungeon. It has rats and straw. A single barred window sits high on a stone wall. A heavy wooden door with a small slot for food is the only way in or out. That is the picture most of us have, and it is not entirely wrong, but it is not the whole story. The reality of medieval prisons was messier, and it was far less organized than what we think of today. First, there was no central prison system, there was no government department in charge of corrections. A prison was simply a place to hold someone, and who held you depended on who you offended. If you broke the king's law, you might end up in a royal castle. The Tower of London is the most famous example. If you crossed a powerful lord, you could be thrown into his private dungeon. If you committed a crime against the church, you might find yourself in a monastery cell. Even towns had their own jails, often just a secure room in the gatehouse or the basement of the town hall. The purpose of these places was also different. Today, prison is often the punishment itself. A judge sentences you to 10 years, and you serve those 10 years. In the Middle Ages, long-term imprisonment as punishment was rare. It happened especially for political enemies, but it was not the norm. Most people were in prison for one of four reasons. They were awaiting trial, they were being held for ransom, they were in debt, or they were a political pawn. Holding a person for trial was common. The justice system was slow and inefficient. A judge or magistrate might only visit a region once or twice a year. So if you were accused of a crime, you would be locked up to make sure you showed up for your court date. The conditions were often terrible, but the goal was not to punish you, just to keep you from running away. If you were found innocent, you were let go. If you were found guilty, your real punishment began. That could be a fine, a public shaming in the stocks, a mutilation like cutting off a hand, or execution. The prison was just the waiting room. Ransom was another major reason for imprisonment. This was especially true for the nobility during wartime. A captured knight or lord was a valuable asset. You did not kill him on the battlefield if you could help it. You captured him and held him in your castle. And then you sent a letter to his family demanding a large sum of money for his release. These high-status prisoners were often treated quite well. They might be given a comfortable room, decent food, and even company. They were more like guests under house arrest. Their prison was not escape-proof because it did not need to be. The prisoner's honor and the complex social rules of chivalry often kept them from trying to flee. To escape would be to break your word, a serious stain on your reputation. And besides, where would you go? You were in enemy territory hundreds of miles from home. Debt was a common reason for a poor person to be jailed. If you could not pay what you owed, your creditor could have you thrown in jail. This was not done by the state, it was a private matter. The idea was that the misery of prison would convince your friends or family to scrape together the money to pay your debt and get you out. The creditor often had to pay the jailer for the prisoner's upkeep, so they had an incentive to see the debt paid quickly. Finally, there was political imprisonment. This is where the classic image of the dungeon comes from. A king might lock up a rival claimant to the throne. A powerful baron might imprison a lesser noble who challenged his authority. These prisoners were not awaiting trial and often had no hope of ransom. Their imprisonment was the punishment. They were meant to be forgotten, to be removed from the world. For them, the prison was meant to be as secure as possible. They were often held in the deepest, most remote parts of a castle, and yet, even from these places, escape was not impossible. The very structure of a medieval prison was a key part of its weakness. Castles were not built to be prisons. They were built as fortresses, as homes, and as centers of power. The dungeons, cellars, and gatehouse rooms used as prisons were afterthoughts. A cellar was designed to store wine, not to hold a human being. A tower room was designed for a guard or a servant. Their construction reflected their original purpose. This created opportunities. The stone wall might look solid, but the mortar holding it together could be old and crumbling. A floor might be made of wooden planks that could be pried up. A window was for light and air, not necessarily to be escape-proof. These were not purpose-built penitentiaries, they were improvised holding cells in buildings designed for something else. And that improvisation was a prisoner's first glimmer of hope. So, how'd you get out? The movies show prisoners patiently scraping at mortar with a spoon for 20 years. Or they show a daring rescue by a band of loyal followers. Both of these things happen. But the most common way to escape a medieval prison was much simpler. It was bribery. The system ran on personal relationships and coin, not on abstract rules and procedures. The guards were the weakest link. A guard was not a professional corrections officer with a pension and a union. He was often a simple man-at-arms. He was probably poorly paid, if he was paid on time at all. He was bored, he stood long, tedious watches, he was likely not a zealot loyal to the king or lord who employed him. He was just a guy doing a job, and his loyalty could often be bought. A wealthy prisoner could offer a guard more money than he might see in a year. The deal was simple. Look the other way. Leave a door unlocked. Pass along a message. Smuggle in a tool. For a man earning a few pence a day, the promise of a bag of silver was a powerful motivator. The risk of getting caught was high, but the reward was life-changing, and it happened all the time. The records are full of accounts of jailers being punished for letting prisoners go. This shows not only that escapes were common, but that authorities knew exactly how they were happening. Even if a prisoner had no money, the guards were still a vulnerability. Negligence was a close cousin to bribery. A guard might get drunk on duty. Wine and ale were a constant part of medieval life. A prisoner could offer to share a drink with his jailer, a seemingly friendly gesture. A few drinks later, the guard is asleep, and his keys are hanging from his belt. Or maybe the guard is just lazy. He does not check the locks properly. He does not inspect the cell for loose stones or bars. He assumes the thick walls are enough. He becomes complacent, and complacency creates opportunity. Their outside help was another major factor. A prisoner was not always alone. He had friends, family, or political allies who wanted him free. They could work from the outside to make an escape possible. This could be as simple as smuggling a message to the prisoner. The message might contain a plan or just words of encouragement to keep his spirits up. Messages could be baked into a loaf of bread, sewn into the hem of a garment, or passed on by a sympathetic priest who was allowed to visit. Sometimes outside help was more direct. A rope could be smuggled in. This was a classic method. A prisoner could get a rope or the materials to make one and use it to descend from a window or a castle wall. It was incredibly dangerous. The ropes were often makeshift, made from torn-up bedding, clothes, or tapestries. They could break. A fall from a castle tower was almost certainly fatal, but for a prisoner facing execution or a lifetime in a dungeon, the risk was worth it. Outside help could also mean creating a distraction. Allies might start a fire on the other side of the castle. Or they might stage a small fake attack. While the garrison rushed to deal with the emergency, the prisoner could slip away in the confusion. This required careful coordination and timing, which was difficult to achieve with limited communication. But when it worked, it was very effective. Then there was the prisoner's own ingenuity. This is where the stories of incredible patience and cleverness come from. The prisoner had nothing but time. Hours and hours, day after day, with nothing to do but observe and think, he would study his cell. He would test the walls, the floor, the door. He would notice the guard's routine. He would find the weaknesses. A small piece of metal, maybe a nail worked loose from a board or a buckle from his own shoe, could become a tool. With endless time, a prisoner could use it to scrape away at the mortar between stones. It was a slow, painstaking process. He would have to hide his work from the guards, covering the dust and debris with straw. But eventually, a stone could be loosened, then another, until he had a hole big enough to squeeze through. Or windows were a common point of attack. The iron bars were set in stone with lead. A prisoner might be able to slowly chip away at the stone or melt the lead if he could somehow get a small controlled fire going. The wooden doors could be attacked. A prisoner could try to splinter the wood or dig at the lock mechanism. It was all about slow, persistent effort. The location of the prison mattered a lot. A prisoner in a town jail had a better chance than one in a remote, heavily fortified castle. In a town, there were more people around, more chances for outside help, more chances for a guard to be distracted. A castle was a self-contained world. Everyone knew everyone. Strangers were noticed. But even the strongest castles were not designed with the single-minded focus of a modern supermax prison. They had kitchens, chapels, living quarters, and storerooms. They had a complex life within their walls. And complexity meant cracks in security. A prisoner might escape his cell only to find himself inside the castle walls. His next challenge was to get out of the castle itself. He might try to scale the outer wall or disguise himself as a servant and walk out the main gate. Every escape was a combination of these factors. A weak wall was useless without a tool to exploit it. A bribed guard was no help if the prisoner had no way to get past the outer wall. A rope from the outside was no good if you could not get to the window. Success depended on finding a chain of weaknesses and exploiting them one by one. And because medieval prisons were so varied and improvised, almost all of them had weaknesses to find. All stories make history real. The theories about weak mortar and bribable guards are one thing. Seeing them in action is another, and the Middle Ages has some incredible escape stories. They show us that these were not just theoretical possibilities, they were real events, carried out by desperate and clever people. One of the most famous escapes from the Tower of London was by a man named Ranulph Flambard. Flambard was a bishop and a powerful, deeply unpopular government official under King William II. When William died and his brother Henry I took the throne in the year 1100, one of his first acts was to arrest Flambard. He was accused of corruption and thrown into the White Tower, the central keep of the Tower of London. He was the first recorded prisoner ever held there. King Henry wanted to make an example of him. The Tower was meant to be the most secure royal prison in England. Flambard was a high-status prisoner. He was not kept in a squalid dungeon. He was given a comfortable room and an allowance to buy his own food and drink. This was a common courtesy for prisoners of his rank, and it proved to be the king's mistake. Flambard used his allowance to order in large quantities of wine. He began to host parties for his guards. He was known as a charming and generous man, and the guards saw no harm in it. They were bored, and a free drink from a bishop was a welcome diversion. One night in February, 1101, Flambard put his plan into action. He had arranged for an especially large delivery of wine. He threw a great feast for his captors. He encouraged them to drink as much as they wanted. Soon, the entire group of guards was drunk and passed out on the floor. While they slept, Flambard retrieved an object his friends had smuggled to him. It was a long, strong rope hidden inside a cask of wine. His cell had a small window high above the ground. He tied one end of the rope to the central pillar of the window frame. Then he began his descent. He was, by all accounts, a portly man. The sources say he was not wearing his breeches, and the rough rope scraped his hands and legs raw on the way down. But he made it. Below, his loyal friends were waiting with horses. They galloped away into the night, rode to the coast, and took a boat to Normandy. The escape was a huge embarrassment for the new king. The most important prisoner in the kingdom had escaped from its most secure prison, not by digging through stone, but by getting his guards drunk. It was a classic example of exploiting the human element. Not all escape attempts ended so well. The story of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn shows the deadly risks involved. Gruffydd was a Welsh prince, the illegitimate son of Llywelyn the Great. After his father's death, there was a power struggle, and Gruffydd was captured by his own half-brother. He was eventually handed over to the English king, Henry III, who saw him as a valuable political hostage. Around 1241, he too was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Unlike Flambard, Gruffydd was not living in comfort. He was held in a high tower, and his prospects for release were bleak. He was a threat to English control in Wales, and the king was not going to let him go. So Gruffydd decided his only hope was to escape. He did not have Flambard's resources to bribe guards or smuggle in professional ropes. He had to improvise. He took his bed sheets, his tablecloths, and any other cloth he could find and began knotting them together to create a makeshift rope. It was a desperate act. The tower he was in was very high, probably over 100 feet. He must have known the rope was not long enough. Perhaps he hoped it would get him far enough down to a lower ledge or a less dangerous drop. One night, on March 1st, 1244, he made his attempt. He secured his cloth rope and began to lower himself out of the window into the darkness. The drop was terrifying. The chronicler Matthew Paris wrote that Gruffydd was a heavy man, and his weight put a terrible strain on the flimsy rope. It did not hold. The knots gave way, or the cloth tore. Gruffydd plunged to the ground. He was killed instantly. The guards found his broken body in the moat the next morning. His story is a tragic counterpoint to Flambard's. It shows what happened when an escape attempt went wrong. It highlights the immense dangers. For every clever prisoner who talked his way out or descended a rope to freedom, there were likely many others who fell, or were caught digging, or were betrayed by a guard they tried to bribe. Their escape was possible, but it was never easy or safe. These two stories, both in the same prison, show the whole picture. Flambard's success came from wealth, connections, and the exploitation of human weakness. He defeated the prison by targeting its people. Gruffydd's failure came from desperation and a lack of resources. He had to rely on a physical escape, pitting his own fragile ingenuity against the massive stone structure of the tower. The stone won. The medieval prison was a contest. Sometimes the prisoner won. Sometimes the prison won. While many medieval prisons had their weaknesses, there were places designed to be as close to escape-proof as humanly possible. These were not the common town jails or the improvised castle cellars. These were places built or used with one purpose in mind, to hold someone so securely that they would lose all hope. The methods were not just about strong walls and locks, they were about psychology. They were designed to break a prisoner's spirit. The most infamous of these was the oubliette. The name comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. That was its purpose. You put someone in an oubliette to forget about them. An oubliette was often a narrow, bottle-shaped chamber, wider at the bottom than at the top. The only entrance was a small trapdoor in the ceiling. The prisoner was lowered down, sometimes with a rope, and then the trapdoor was shut and locked. And that was it. There was no other door, no window. The prisoner was plunged into total darkness. They were left alone in a confined space, often with a sloping floor that made it difficult to stand or lie comfortably. Food and water would be lowered periodically, but human contact was non-existent. The isolation was absolute. The psychological toll would have been immense. Days and nights would blur into one long, dark moment. The sense of abandonment would be complete. Escaping from an oubliette was nearly impossible. You could not dig through the stone walls with your bare hands. You could not bribe a guard you never saw. You could not climb the sheer walls to reach the trapdoor high above. Your only hope was that someone from the outside would remember you and stage your rescue. But the very nature of the oubliette was to make you forgotten. People were put there to disappear. While they are a famous feature in castles, true oubliettes were probably not as common as stories suggest. But they represent the extreme of medieval imprisonment, a place where the primary security feature was hopelessness. Beyond specific devices like the oubliette, certain castles gained a reputation for being inescapable. These were often fortresses built with the latest military technology designed to withstand a siege. And features that made a castle hard to get into also made it hard to get out of. Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, built by Richard the Lionheart, was one such place. It was a masterpiece of defensive architecture with concentric walls, interlocking fields of fire, and a formidable keep. Being imprisoned, there would have been a daunting prospect. The sheer amount of stone and the number of guards between you and freedom would seem overwhelming. The Tower of London, despite the escapes of Flambard and the attempt by Gruffydd, was also considered a top-tier prison. Its security evolved over time. It was not just one tower, but a complex of buildings surrounded by massive walls and a wide moat. It was the heart of royal power in England, with a permanent garrison. To escape, a prisoner did not just need to get out of his cell. He needed to get out of the inner bailey, then the outer bailey, and then across the moat, all while avoiding patrols and sentries. Each step was another layer of security, but the most effective tool for preventing escape was often not physical at all. It was the simple act of weakening the prisoner. This was not always a deliberate strategy, but it was an effect of the conditions. A prisoner was often given poor food and dirty water. This led to malnutrition and disease. A weak, sick person is not going to have the strength to dig through a wall or fight a guard. And cold was a constant enemy. Dungeons were underground, unheated, and damp. The chill would seep into a prisoner's bones, leaving them lethargic and miserable. Lack of light in a deep dungeon would affect their mental and physical health. The combination of poor nutrition, sickness, cold, and darkness was a powerful form of control. It drained a prisoner of the physical energy and the mental fortitude needed to even think about escaping. So while we often think of escape-proof prisons in terms of clever traps and thick walls, the reality was often more grim and mundane. The most secure prison was not necessarily the one with the strongest door. It was the one that systematically broke down the prisoner's will to live, let alone escape. It was a prison that used despair as its primary wall. For many unfortunate souls, this combination of physical security and psychological pressure was entirely effective. They did not escape. They simply wasted away, forgotten by the world outside. That was the dark, successful side of medieval imprisonment. So were medieval prisons escape-proof? The short answer is no. Not even close, but that answer is not very interesting. Right. The more interesting question is why they were not. The reasons tell us a lot about the medieval world and how it was different from our own. The lack of a centralized system was a major factor. A prison security depended entirely on the resources and attention of the person who ran it. A powerful king could afford to build strong walls and pay many guards at the Tower of London. A minor lord in a small castle might have only a few men to guard his prisoners, and he might not have the money to repair a crumbling wall. The quality of security was inconsistent. There was no national standard for what a prison should be. It was an improvised system, and improvisation always leaves gaps. The very concept of the prison was also different. It was not primarily a place of punishment and rehabilitation. It was a holding area. For many prisoners, especially those held for ransom or debt, there was an expectation that they would be released eventually. The imprisonment was temporary. This mindset would have affected the way prisons were run. The focus was on short-term containment, not on building a facility for permanent incarceration. Why spend a fortune on an inescapable cell for a debtor who might pay up next week, or a knight whose family is already gathering the ransom? The most important reason, though, comes down to people. The medieval world was built on a web of personal loyalties, relationships, and obligations. This system was strong in many ways, but it was also vulnerable to human failings. A guard's loyalty to his lord could be overwritten by his loyalty to a bag of gold. His sense of duty could be washed away by a cask of wine. His vigilance could be eroded by boredom and complacency. As security was not an impersonal system of cameras, sensors, and procedures. It was a man with a spear standing in a hallway. And that man could be tricked, bribed, or simply be bad at his job. Prisoners were also part of this web of relationships. They were not anonymous numbers in a system. They had families, friends, and allies on the outside who could help them. Communication was slow and difficult, but it was not impossible. A plan could be made. A rope could be delivered. A rescue could be attempted. The walls of the prison did not completely sever the prisoner from his world. The physical structures themselves were a product of their time. A castle was a magnificent piece of engineering, but it was designed to keep an army out, not to keep one man in. Its focus was outward. A prisoner, working from the inside, could find weaknesses that an attacking army would never see. The old mortar, the wooden floors, the drainage channels, these were all potential pathways to freedom. The prisoner had the advantage of time and focus. The guards had to worry about the entire castle. The prisoner only had to worry about his one small part of it. When we look back at the medieval period, it is easy to see only the stone and iron. And we see the massive castles and the heavy chains and think of them as absolute. But that is a modern perspective. Well, we live in a world of highly organized, state-run systems. We expect institutions to be efficient and secure. The medieval world was more personal, more chaotic, and more human. Its prisons reflected that. They were not escape-proof because the world they existed in was not leak-proof. Money, influence, and loyalty could flow in unexpected ways. A clever person could exploit the cracks in the system. An escape was not a miracle. It was a failure of a very human system of security. So, while the dungeon remains a powerful symbol of ultimate confinement, the reality is that its door was often unlocked by a silver coin, a sleeping guard, or a rope woven from bedsheets. The medieval prison was a challenge, not a final sentence, and it was a challenge that a surprising number of people managed to overcome.